quote that we start every week with on our Mindset Moment on Mondays, and that was, in fact, about journalism. And the quote goes like this: journalism has changed tremendously because of the democratization of information. Anybody can put something up on the internet, and it's harder and harder to find what the truth is. So says Robert Redford. I thought it was interesting that those words came from a source like that. Not because it's not credible, but because Robert Redford is known to us as someone who brings us pictures and images and emotions. To me, that was a quote that is very meaningful for today's times. And we're going to focus on looking at what we're doing here in this world as it relates to our career path, our communities, and the cultures that are in and surrounding those communities. So, as I say that, I want to bring you to my first guest. You can actually see he's live with us today. That's Ray Suarez. And Ray, I'm gonna ask people to listen to you tell them about your past. I mean, you got some network initials that can come after your name that people will be able to relate to and resonate with. But I think what's more important is what's been happening in the last 18 months to 2 years for you, and how that set up today's show about career, community, and culture. So welcome, Ray Suarez.
Good to be with you. I came to a dead end. I mean, it's tough to describe it any other way. But you can't just stand there at a dead end. I was too young. I'm not done working. I have a lot of years of productivity ahead of me. But the surprise for me was that I had planned that the later part of my career and the later part of my life would go on. It's gone another, and I've had to adjust in ways that don't necessarily make me happy, but you still have to adjust. And that's what I've been up against now. Even though I've got considerable experience, written 3 books with major publishers, spoken to audiences of millions of people for years, year in and year out, covered stories in 35 countries on 5 continents. It just doesn't matter. Ageism is hard. It's hard to get around. I do the obvious things like dropping the dates of my graduation off of resumes and stuff like that. But there's no getting around the fact that I am older than I used to be. Actually, for those of you keeping score at home, I'm exactly 25 years older today than I was 25 years ago. And yet competing with people who are 25 years younger for some of the same jobs. And they're getting them, even though they are less experienced, with less of a track record, arguably, you might say, less qualified. But we can talk more about what that word means in 2020, because it doesn't necessarily mean what you... How I had really driven by the way I was raised, driven by the atmosphere in my family, to be really careful about security, about saving for my retirement, about paying for all my kids' education, paying off my house. Never once during all those years when I was doing those things, imagining that I would be almost unemployable at 63. And that's where I find myself now. And you got to dig deep. You got to dig deep. Well, and you got to dig deep all the time.
And Ray, I want to ask you to dig deep with us and share where that energy comes from the cultural experience you've had, the family influences, and so take us back to the origin of your family and how that brought you to the East Coast, to the Upper East Coast, as well as you've traveled the country, you've traveled the world in your studies as well as your vocation. But I think for today's discussion, they need to really kind of feel that Ray Suarez, the man, the educator, the professor, where those roots were developed.
My family came to the mainland United States from Puerto Rico in the early 50s, settling in Brooklyn, which is where I was born. When I was born, my father was active duty terror a little until I was old, and she was up, and we went back to did my growing there at York University, and that I might have a shot. Parents were a little afraid because they couldn't look in the media landscape of New York in the 1960s at very many models of Puerto Ricans who had made their way in the mainstream news business. There just weren't very many people you could point to. And my mother said to me, I think you better get a teaching license just in case this doesn't work out. And I appreciated that it was coming from a good place, that it was not because she doubted my ability or doubted my smarts or doubted my tenacity. Yeah. She was just afraid, given the realities of New York in the 60s and 70s, the persistent discrimination against blacks and Latinos in the city, that I could be talented and have a lot on the ball and still not get any work. I thanked her. I didn't get the teaching license. And I went to work in the business and put together 40 good years banging away in various local and network shops and getting a lot of experience along the way, but also putting in place the lessons that I learned growing up about frugality, about so that live below my means. I thought it was a good idea. Little did I know it would be preparation at a time when my means were going to change drastically.
Well, I thank you so much for those details, because it sets us up for the first segment of introduction to Rick Salinger, who is, as I said before, a CBS Channel 4 news broadcaster here in Denver. But as the intersection for the three of us is Chicago, he's had almost equal to you in travel, covering world events as a war correspondent over in London for a number of years. But his first comment today is also going to be the last, because he did such a great job in his style to succinctly bring us to this point. So let me bring us to a shared screen on our Zoom technology and share with everybody exactly what Mr. Salinger has to say.
After covering just about everything I thought I could cover, including 3 wars, 2020 has been a year like no other year. Who would have imagined that we would have a pandemic? Who would have imagined the unrest that has occurred following the police killing of George Floyd? Who would imagine both of these things happening at the same time and having to operate in the environment that we're in? So I guess the one thing that we can take away from all this is we never know what lies ahead.
I'm going to let that last thought kind of sink in, Ray, because we don't really know what lies ahead. Just like to your mother's words when she said to you, have a plan B, son. She may have said it in a different way than that, but the meaning was the same, and you really didn't know what was ahead. It was times were shaky as they are today. So I'm going to ask you to move forward and take a look at the career path now. And that you said, as you said, I'm not going to stop. There's a dead end. I'm not going to stop. I'm going to find an alternative path. What would you say to others as you have yourself sitting in where you're at when they're facing those same obstacles and impediments? What's their resolution? What's the resolve that you want to share with them?
I graduated into the teeth of a terrible recession in the late 1970s. Maybe your viewers and listeners have seen a very famous New York Daily News line, Ford City dropped time that I was leaving college and getting my first jobs in the news business. New York looked like a dead letter. Didn't look like it was going to be a going concern into the future. Corporations and jobs were high, and for a while I was poor. I mean, there's just no other way to say it. I freelanced. I did various low-wage jobs. I guess would have been if I had just given up and said, well, this isn't going to work out. I have to do something else that has a more likely career path than try to break into a business and really appear like it wants me in it anyway. But I didn't do that. And if you've got a clear idea about what you want and what you need out of a job, not just materially, but also emotionally, mentally, spiritually, don't pull the ripcord the first sign of crisis. You've got to be smart, strategic. You've got to be realistic, but you don't have to give anything. Just looks like it's going to be hard. Life is long, and crises sometimes are short, and you might just have to wait it out. You might have to change your presumed timeline some. That is, really get started and start to get traction a year later or 2 years later than you had originally planned. That doesn't mean you have to give up on everything right away. I was on the bricks and cobbling together a living for a lot longer than I thought I was going to be because of unforeseen circumstances. NBC had brought a huge number of news people to New York to start a 24-hour radio news network. And after promising those people that they'd be employed in New York for a long time, they pulled the plug on the network mere months after they had put it on the air, flooding the market with qualified, experienced people, just as I was starting to look for work. And luckily, I had cross-trained when I was in college, and so was capable of working in print and broadcasting, and got my first job as an editor at a business magazine, something that a lot of my radio contemporaries weren't really prepared to do. But I had a pile of clips. I had published work to send to prospective employers, and not long after that, did finally head to work.
Now, Ray, the streets
wasn't exactly what I wanted. It wasn't on the timetable I wanted. It wasn't with the money I wanted. It wasn't a lot of things that I wanted, but it got me started, and that was the key.
You know, you have a lot of common premises that young people today that are graduating seniors are going to face the same thing. But the one difference for those graduating seniors that you have duality in is the streets are different. Back then, when you were struggling, that was one set of way the streets looked, but now they're not safe, literally not safe. So it's the virtual world of presenting your works. It's the virtual world of differentiating yourself as the candidate of choice through an electronic medium. How are you facing that challenge?
I wouldn't for a second minimize how daunting it is to get started, to get traction, to start putting together a sequence of jobs and proof of performance that actually starts to get you somewhere. The business has changed utterly and totally since I went into it for the first time to draw a paycheck more than 40 years ago. It's been changed by technology. It's been changed by the vast transformation of the regulations that undergirded the business. When I first was getting started, the most any one company could own was 7 AM radio stations, 7 FM radio stations, and 5 television stations. And none of those television stations could be in a market where the owner also owned the newspaper. And there were very tight restrictions on that kind of thing. The concentration of ownership that we've seen in recent decades is breathtaking. 5 companies pretty much run everything now, even things that you don't realize they run because of constant mergers and acquisitions. There are in the midst new creative work and creative channels where the work rolls out. There are actually fewer people making a living as journalists in America than there were 20 years ago. So it means everybody's working harder, longer hours, and putting out more stuff because there's so much more stuff that's. It also means a lot more contingent workers, a lot more people who are producing content and giving it away, which of course undermines the value of all the other work that's being produced. If employers can get content for free, that's that favorite price. That's the price they love more than the other price. Ooh, I can get content free. But the next person who comes along might have something better, but they want to get paid for it. It's a very, very interesting landscape for today's young content creator who wants to get in there and compete and get up the career. Would minimize that for a second.
So, Ray,
it also means that you have to be. Go ahead.
I was going to say, so do you have a strategy for yourself about where you want to put your content? Because my belief is there's so many platforms that are freely accessible to put your content in, but there's not a lot of clarity on how to monetize that dump. Whereas in the past, if you got an article in a newspaper or magazine, they paid you. And if you were really good at it, they retained you. And that was kind of a secure blanket to have. Nowadays, that security doesn't seem to be there, at least in my opinion.
No, I think you're absolutely right. You can't point to a single item in a newspaper and say to a prospective employer, it's good to have me in the paper. Because there's 500 other people who want to get their stuff in the paper too, and they may be willing to underbid you. There are, right now, there's now a surplus of entrants to the marketplace, which means the marketplace is more crowded with sellers. The number of buyers is shrinking. So that means the whip hand, the market power, is in the hands of the buyers. They can sort through huge numbers of people who are creating content and say, yeah, I'll take you, you forget it. It's very hard to stand out in that marketplace, and it's very difficult to put together enough different gigs to make a living. When I was going to work for that business magazine in New York in the late 1970s, they had a magazine to get out, and they knew that I had a body of work to produce, and our expectations from each other were clear. They were going to pay me every 2 weeks. They were going to pay for my health insurance. They were going to make the payroll tax contributions to my Social Security check. And in return, I was going to produce a very well understood amount of work that was going to fit the news hole in the magazine every week. Now, that same person kind of work, be working purely line, be contingent labor, that is, without a staff job with the company that's putting out the publication. They're paying their own Social Security, they're paying their own health insurance, paying for their own life insurance, and they are working for their clients at the same time. It is, you have to be your own business in it, being your own employee, in addition to keeping your own nose to the grindstone, because you've got no boss saying, well, tomorrow you have to do this. Today you hit this market, got this burn. Tomorrow you have to do this. It has to come from in you. So it's significantly more challenging than it was when you walked into an ongoing business. You took the place of the person who had left just before and took that job. The duties of the job were well understood. The amount of output was well understood. And the arrangement that you made with your employer was well understood. You didn't worry about 50 other people trying to elbow you out for the same amount of work. The competitive situation has changed utterly. The company and the expectations between content buyer and content producer have changed entirely. It's made it all that much more difficult and more challenging. Now, look, somebody who is just getting into it doesn't have the wind at their back in some of the ways that I do. When I talk to a publisher or a news director or executive producer of a podcast distribution network, they already know who I am. The reason they're taking my call is because they already know who I am. They've seen my byline. They've read my books. They've heard my interviews. They've seen me on television. So I have the wind at my back, as difficult as it is. It's much more daunting for someone who's just trying to get in the door and start getting content out to people's eardrums and eyeballs. They have no brand that they can work off of. They have no reputation yet that they can work off of. They will eventually. They don't yet. And that makes it difficult.
Ray, in the age of the social media platforms, there are so many to choose from. It seems to me that trust, quality of material, and truth tend to be diluted in favor of being monetized, getting hits, getting number of people following you. I've talked to a lot of media distributors, and they want to know about the athletes that I work with and how many followers they have, because they use that as a measuring stick for being able to draw advertisers to sell product or sell service. So in the world of journalism and education, where does that sit, that search for truth as a way to not only promote and build your rep, but to say to somebody that's a hiring body, I can bring this to your table. This quality of work is something I can do regardless of the incident we're covering. And in a minute, we're going to talk about an incident that happened here that merges the career and the truth and community into one thing. But it was generated, the report was generated by a newspaper. And so I'm wondering, where does truth sit as a driver to monetizing the material and value that you bring to the table?
Truth has moved from being the absolute single most important imperative value to one of several values. And that's that's a tough environment to be in. You want to getting about now by people who inconvenient, unpleasant, by a president who really wades into social media platforms and distributes ideas, impressions, assertions, simply either through what the truth is, being that interested in what it is. Who can know I know his book, but it is unquestionable that he disputes a lot of ideas that are not true. And I can't imagine presidents doing it this volume to and I can't imagine a president so low that this would be MO. I can't imagine. Oh, it isn't just because Twitter didn't exist yet, that Dwight Eisenhower doesn't come up as someone who would deal in questionable that you can't imagine George H.W. Bush signing on day after day, falsehoods into the public's bloodstream. So we're in a real moment where occasionally I'll go on the media criticism show on Fox called Media Buzz. and I will calmly, straightforwardly, peacefully assert the truth, things I know to be the truth, and my Twitter feed lights up with, frankly, some crazy people who simply can't saying was contradicted by a very powerful and popular proposer named. So truth is taking a big matter. This idea that truth is what most people say it is instead of what's true, which is I don't know if I want to live in a world like that where the truth becomes something that we vote on by popular plebiscite or something like that. And the truth is the truth.
And I want to add to your comments, Ray, that as of today, Twitter made a statement condemning the manipulation of a piece that 45 posted that looked like a CNN report, but it was manipulated and created by his people. And they are evaluating whether, again, they're going to evaluate whether they're going to sanction him because he violated one of their rules. Now, as they say that, Facebook comes out with a similar statement that says we're okay with it because they posted the same thing on Facebook. So not only do we have this, where is truth? Where does it sit? What value does it have? But we also have, to your point about voting, we may already be voting in the public domain about what is the right place to put it versus what's the right place to trust the truth. And as I say that, I'm watching the screen on my Facebook broadcast and seeing people that I appreciate and value, that I'm hoping they're watching me because I'm bringing some truth they can trust, but also more importantly, bringing information like what you're supplying about how to evaluate the truth, what sources to look to that I can trust to give me the truth. So I'm really excited about hopefully continuing to build this surge of information. Like today, for example, we are in a recognition of history today that is not overly recognized historically, and that's Juneteenth. It's a celebration, and there are some slices of that celebration that are about black females and their struggle, but more importantly, Juneteenth is about emancipation of a people enslaved. And it seemed to have been the last step of that was in Texas, when a general of the Union Army was the last person to get the last state, which was Texas, the furthest away from the coast, to be told, guess what? Your slaves are now emancipated. Which is also what makes sense why Texas seems to be the one who most often celebrates with its black communities Juneteenth. But as I say that, I'm also recognizing the fact that this week also recognizes historically the massacre in Tulsa. And that until about 3 or 4 months ago, Wikipedia was still recognizing it as a riot. And recently, I think in March or April, changed it and said it was a massacre. And that over 300 black citizens, young and old, were killed. So I'm using this as a segue, Ray, to move us towards your thoughts about the link I sent you about that news report about those 2 football players in a career path. 2 career paths, trying to pursue a college football career as the same time in the summer months when they have a part-time job. Fully dressed, labeled as being part of that path. And one of them, interestingly enough, a black man with his white teammate, was the one put on the ground by an armed citizen who, I think to his own mistake, called the police thinking he was doing the right thing, holding someone at gunpoint because he thought they were going to create an anarchist event. He thought they were from Antifa. I don't know how that happens when you're in khaki pants and red shirts.
Because Antifa, Wild Boys always wearing polo shirts when they head out. I mean, it's so stupid that you even your head around That's where we are at the moment. And as terrible as it is, and I want to make the fear and kind of inflation you for those kinds of things happen. These are the kinds of things that for years people said, oh, that doesn't happen. When it is citizens would each counters with the wrong, say this happened. That tens of millions of people are walking around high definition video cameras in their pocket. We're now seeing ourselves that yes, these things do happen. They don't happen every day, everywhere, to everyone. They do happen. They have corrosive effect, not just on that one person's idea of their own safety, being around white people, being around certain neighbors, being around police. It's the corrosive effect that have their relationship with everyone who is not America really yet to come to terms with what that means. Stop It went on in New York year after year after year, caught almost no one. They patted down and on the street in a humiliating way. They would stop Latino and black men in New York, and in full view, they didn't take them somewhere to frisk them. They didn't take them somewhere else out of the view of the public. It was right on the sidewalk, and hands on the hood of a car, humiliating. And then they would be allowed to go on there. Eventually, the statistics were so overwhelming that this was mostly done to black men, that hardly any chargeable crimes came from this investigative tool, that they finally had to stop it. And Michael Bloomberg, of the stop and frisk period, said we have to keep it. Crime will go up after we get rid of it. Crime continued to go down. He just couldn't understand the burden that that kind of relationship with the police had on young men who believe, you look white police that is going. So as much as I feel for that to the ground, and the fact that it was not by Martin Peace off, but just some schmo with a gun makes it even worse. Because we're going to see a lot more of that as more people take it upon themselves to be sidewalk vigilantes and enforce the law. I'm glad the story gets told in a way that people can see, yes, this is what really goes on in a lot of American streets.
And Ray, I'm gonna with that statement, that perfect segue into this next segment from Rick Salinger, because it's going to show a contrast from the days that you and Rick struggled to get your reporting jobs, the kind of consequences and trials and obstacles that were thrown up in front of you, versus those two genuine, sincere football players trying to make money in the summer months before their season begins in today's situations. And here is that report from Rick.
Continuing on, after I got that dream job in Chicago radio, one day NBC decided it was full. It was all news radio network. And all of us who got hired on for that got laid off. I remember the boss coming around with a pink slip, so I decided to hide. I even went under a desk, and he eventually caught up with me. And I said, well, Lou, the least we can do is write me a letter of recommendation. So he said, all right. And he took out his notepad and he wrote on it, Rick, you're an asshole. Lou. That was my letter of recommendation.
So you see, Rick's obstacle for his loss of employment, the challenge he was facing, I think it's self-evident. It's not equal to what's going on today. Even with yourself and others younger or even perhaps older that are looking for employment. I have colleagues of mine around the country that were CEOs, and the board let them go because of economics and because of whatever situations they would create in their minds. But I think calling you an asshole in your letter of reference is sublime compared to a gun in the small of your back and being told that you're part of an anarchist group by the name of Antifa.
That's it. And it's funny that he experienced the downdraft of the same event that I cited earlier.
Yes, exactly.
And NBC disbanding its own news radio network.
Yeah.
That was and he was already in Chicago. I was in New York, but it's the same event. It was in situations early in my career, order. The jobs, cops at police lines at the police department would say, they couldn't believe it. So, I mean,
So, Ray, when you've been, I mean, it's been less than a year that you've faced these issues, right? I mean, because last year you were a college professor and you were still doing some stuff with some PBS channels locally, right?
I would occasionally went on when I was teaching at Amherst College, I was visiting professor of American Studies. It was a long time. And occasionally on television, public television station, and also was doing occasional commentary on MSNBC. So I'm trying to keep a hand in during elections. Western Massachusetts for the
Well, I'm setting this up because I want to get us to the cultural side of things, because I think, I'm a big believer in a Native American culture and how they looked at the elderly and how they valued knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge and understanding at deep levels, at an organic or natural level, and bringing it full circle to today's world. I think we're looking at a revelation of understanding of where we place knowledge with the truth and who we trust when we find that knowledge. And it should not always be economically driven. Don't go find the cheapest to get by, because there can be a lot of benefit to staying focused on what we need to know about the future from those who've already been there through similar examples. So I want to make sure that I get your thoughts on opportunity and the connection that needs to be made clearly stated to companies who are going to survive. I just came back from Nashville and visiting one of my clients, and it's a family-owned business that was recently acquired in a very nice transaction before the pandemic with a multinational company. And their family mindset and entrepreneurial spirit is being valued more by the parents at a surprising rate to the acquisition, my client who was acquired. So I'm asking you, where does family and the connection of what you know, the history you bring to the table, how do you want to value that to companies who historically have said, you know what, we got to go with the younger body, or we got to save money in the younger body? I think you have value. I think you have a place to pitch that story. Where do you sit on that particular platform of thinking?
Well, now when I'm making a value proposition to a news organization, I'm actually to bring it'd be a good idea to have somebody who remembers Watergate in the newsroom.
Yeah. Yes.
You to have somebody who this last impeachment of the valuable what and instead there are things I'm seeing by news organizations that show that mind much the thing run space to run to country is changing in a way that monochrome news will not be able to cover the America of 2030. If you continue to hire same people to do the same jobs forever and ever, you will be successful one day to find that your coverage area, be it Denver, be it New York, Boston, be it Houston, has changed in a way that you and your operation and decides you no longer have very much to say to it, the community. But as people has shown ways if we put to each other. As people in parts of the country have hidden themselves, this pandemic is limited to the coasts and big cities, something that they have because they haven't heard. We are in those bonds. We are creating a news base deeply connected to the places presumed to cover. I worry about that because I want a business that is prepared, ready to attach today to our shared past and also talk of the shared future. Way in 1944, the majority, going to be a tiny bit, but a majority of Americans, their ancestry to Asia and Latin America rather than to Europe. For the first time in the history of the United States as a country. Will we use this ready culture that is comfortable with the idea, that is ready for that, and a business community that understands historical and culture of that moment? Nobody was talking about the Proud Boys or the All Right. Nobody was in petitions around statues of Confederate generals chanting, "You will not replace us." It's to be a much more complicated road to that majority.
You know, Ray, you mentioned that the statues, and recently in New Mexico, there was a statue of a conquistador that was torn down. And in that process, a young person that was trying to do that was shot. And that conquistador was a known reputation in the history of that conquistador of abusing and brutally physically hurting Native Americans because they were part of his slave kind of thing. And I'm wondering if it's not just about we're looking more critically at differentiation, marginalization, and so I'm kind of glad that we've got pandemic, we've got protesters, but I'm also glad that we're taking really close looks at the layers of the onion we're peeling back to make sure that we've got clarity. My concern is, are there enough voices in that small majority you talked about that will be succinct and loud enough in their synchronicity to be able to get the attention of those that need to hear? Because we can talk to the audience and the choir, but we need to talk to the people in the pews, because the choir already knows. They already get the beat. They get the rhythm, and that's what I'm hoping that's going to happen with this. It's like a pandemic of progression, a progressional attitude of thinking. What have you been seeing with the students you've taught, the people you're talking to in your sessions on radio? Are you feeling that same movement, or am I just too hopeful?
No, I think there are a lot of people already anticipating that moment that will come in the 2040s. Students were born around the turn of the century, and the America they've grown up with is one that I did. 2010, the first time, in the maternity wards of American hospitals, more children were born of ancestry of Europe than European for the first time in the history of the United States. And it's been true every year since, and will be true every year from now on. Those kids hit pre-K in 2014. They are now in middle school. They will be filling out their college applications in 2027. They'll be entering the workforce in huge numbers around 2030, both after community college, after 4-year programs, the early 2030s. Many will enter the military. They are working their way through population. Kids, I have 3 kids, 31, 29, and 20, and they have grown up in a world much more diverse than the one that I grew up in, or my wife grew up in. So they accept it as sort of baked into the cake already, rather than something you have to work to achieve or something you have to struggle and grope your way toward. They understand this is their America. So in some ways they are already fit for the times. Also, and this is going to be sort of contrary to the tone, a lot of things that I said earlier in the program, the breaking up of the business into smaller and smaller pieces, and a lot of self-publishing and self-production means that there are a stunningly diverse number of voices that can be heard now, and new green shoots, essayists and authors and filmmakers and video producers and musical artists, all kinds of creators who would have found a very narrow door to have to struggle their way through 10 years ago, 20 years ago, who now, because of the amazing opportunities provided by cheaper and more powerful technology and the internet together. I mean, look at this platform that we're talking to each other on now that didn't exist even a few years ago. This camera mounted in the lid of my laptop, which is better than a camera that I could have gone to a store and bought. And it's just thrown in as an accessory. This microphone that I use to make podcasts, and this microphone that I use to make high definition voice recording. It's all an amazing new frontier. This is of the quality that would have been strictly reserved for television and radio stations 30 years ago. Nobody would have had one this good in their house, but now it's actually accessible, available, usable. The skill on it is shallower, so you don't have to do a lot of work in order to be able to use it with confidence and competence. So a whole new creative gush. Look at the podcast industry. that's come out of nowhere for there to be 850,000 podcasts now, and some of them are even worth listening to. So we're in the midst of an explosion of people's creative desire merging with the creative possibilities of the technology to make it easy, little and a little visual being able to get heard. And it's a wonderful thing.
Well, Ray, as we get closer to the end of the show, I want to make sure I make it a point to my audience as well as to you that I don't want this to be the last time you talk here. The KUHS radio television is a international streaming station. We're in the top 5 of those streaming around the world. So once we end this show today, it will be pushed out to other multiple platforms to get a world audience. There are some that listen to us right now. We're streaming on Facebook Live, and we're pushing that out to multiple platforms on YouTube at the same time we push it out on Facebook Live. But as I say that, I also want to make sure to remind everybody that as Ray and I talked, we talked about how to monetize it and bring that truth forward, so that, and to do that we got to pay for it. It's a commercial situation here. We're capitalists. So with that being said, I want to make sure my audience knows that as I plan to bring Ray and Rick Salinger and others that I know together, we've got a session coming up in September that I'm going to we're going to put together a produced panel of experts to talk about world issues from perspectives that represent the youthful in mind and body, but not necessarily only that. We're going to bring in the people that have seen and heard about the Clinton errors and the Nixon errors, and they were even there, so we can bring some relevancy to moving forward with this technology. Because right now, as you said, we can have a studio on the desktop that's of a high HD quality. It doesn't have to be in big rooms. That also speaks to your point earlier about culture is going to be housed in smaller and smaller places, but still very vibrant and dynamic in that limited physical space, because we can bring it out of that space and go anywhere we want, and in our backpack have a studio and capture all these great stories. And for me, ultimately, Ray, you represent great stories, just like Rick does. And I think it's the power of the story that really brings the possibility of economic reward. And it's not so much how youthful the broadcaster is, but it's more important how meaningful and worthy and productive the story is to sharing. As you know from being a professor and an educator, you see what it looks like in the face of the student when you've made the connection. And that's really what monetizes. If anybody that's got the money that's worth it, and we both know people that have spent a lot of money on worthless stuff. And I want to make sure that you know, from me to you, that we're going to continue to strive to stream the right stories to anybody who wants to listen about what we have to say. Now, that being said, I'm going to ask you, Ray, to give me your thoughts about the takeaways. What do you want people to know from today and going forward about the takeaways of Ray Suarez?
I think given the political and economic situation of June 2020, you should plan on the next couple of years being very challenging. And acting like it's up to you weren't expecting it, start to fix both your expectations and your game plan around the idea that we've got a couple of tough years ahead. If we're wrong, and it turns out that the economy opens and recovers more quickly, you'll be ready for that, and you'll be fine. If I'm right, and I think I am, you'll also be ready to share both your output and what you're trying to get accomplished and your expectations about the reward to a somewhat narrowed horizon. I'm going to be speaking in a couple of months to a graduate class from university in Virginia where graduation didn't happen in May. And everybody's going to come back in October, and we're going to come back to campus to a world transformed in those months between when I was invited to come speak to them and when I'm actually going to see them in October. And it's not going to be a happy picture in a lot of ways, but their capital, themselves and everything they've learned is still going to be valuable 2 years from now. Still going to be valuable and a half from now. Don't despair, but buckle down. We've got some tough times ahead.
With that being said, I'll close out the show today and ask Ray to stick with me after I shut down the show for today. I've got some end of show, kind of behind the scenes talk with you. But in that moment we have right now, let me just say thank you to everybody out there every week on Fridays when we stream 360 Performance, a show about getting better, giving you information and examples of how to challenge yourself in the best way possible so that you can find those other intangibles that you knew were there but didn't know how to quite grab onto them, so that you can fight the good fight and walk the brick and survive in the manner that Ray has shared with us today, and that Rick Salinger, at the same time, in different places, was challenged and faced his obstacles as well as a young person. But both of them have said today that it's keep on keeping on. It's meet it, address it, identify it, as we've talked here, see the negative, identify it, get rid of it, and move on with the positives that you're left with. I want to thank Ray Suarez in his time for the day. I wish you all the best, my friend, and we will be talking more in the future. So stick with me. Everybody else, have a great day and a wonderful weekend. Be well. All right, friend, we're off the air. I want to just make sure you know that I'm serious and sincere about helping you to have more of a voice in better places that will pay you when you say it. Because I believe in you. I have for a number of years, and I regret that I haven't reached out sooner. I've said the same thing to Rick Salinger, but I've gone further down the path with him.